November 8th, 2004, Everquest 2 was released, a fantasy MMO produced by Sony Online Entertainment, the sequel to one of the most successful and influential MMORPGs of all time, Everquest. This sequel was going to be everything and anything that MMO players could possibly ever want. They took all the good from Everquest 1 and trimmed all the bad. They made all the right changes, the classes were more fleshed out, the UI was streamlined, the world was massive, and the graphics were updated. Why did a game with so much potential and so much... Oh, World of Warcraft came out? Oh, it came out 2 weeks later? Okay, that makes sense. Unfortunately for Everquest 2, World of Warcraft's release with its focus on a more casual and mainstream audience took much of the attention away from Everquest. Though Everquest 2 did a lot of things right, World of Warcraft did a lot more things more right. Especially in 2004 when the MMO audience was a fraction of what it would end up being in just a few years, mainly due to World of Warcraft's success. So where does that leave Everquest 2? Well, the game is still actively receiving updates almost 20 years later. The player base is of course quite small and dwindling, but what is this game that had such high expectations? What does it look like in the year 2023? Well, we're gonna get into all of that, but first, a bit about my personal experience with Everquest. You see, I was first introduced to MMORPGs when I was probably 4 years old, because of my dad. He played the hell out of Everquest 1. He had a level 60 half-elf ranger, and I thought that was just the coolest thing. So, at 4 years old, I attempted to play Everquest 1. Usually, I was able to get a character to like level 3 before I died, and then I made a new character because dying was actually pretty punishing in the original Everquest. But when Everquest 2 was announced, I was 8 years old, and me and my dad were actually pretty excited, and I did get to play a bit on release. So, though my knowledge of Everquest 2 is very, very limited, I have played the game, and I'm looking forward to seeing if there's anything I can recognize, or if it looks radically different in 2023. Well, I'm gonna play it for 100 hours and decide for myself. Oh, and just as a quick side note, even though this game was developed by Sony Entertainment, in 2015 it was purchased by an investment company named Columbus Nova, which later rebranded to Daybreak Games. We'll get into more on that later. What in the Kinos rat-infested sewers is a heroic character? Ah, I see. So you are first greeted with the option of a membership, which as far as I can tell also gives you a level boost to level 120. Just for a bit of context here, Everquest 2 was made free to play in the year 2010. When I used to play, the max level was 60, but it seems the level cap has doubled since then. Okay, interesting. Well, I'm gonna make a normal character as I plan on staying free to play for this one. Immediately, I was surprised at the amount of different classes that were available to choose from, with 4 different styles, each having 6 unique classes, totaling 24 different playable classes in the game. Many of them sounding super unique and interesting. Cool. I chose the assassin class because I wanted to be able to say the word ass twice every time I mention my class. Why does the gnome look like Ozzy Osbourne? Anyway, character customization was hilariously in-depth given the graphics, and I noticed that one of the playable races was a cat. So, of course, having my decision already made for me, I chose to be a Kara assassin, and I picked the starting zone of Kinos because I'm pretty sure that was the starting zone that I played in as a child. I was immediately taken out to sea and greeted with voice acting by Captain Varlos.
Ahoy! 'Tis good to see you awake. You seem a little squiffy. Least you cheated death.
But then I quickly noticed that my game was lagging, like a ridiculous amount for a 20-year-old game, and I realized the game was downloading and installing extremely slowly in the background. This was causing massive performance issues, so after waiting nicely for all of the game to complete its download, which took way longer than you would expect a 20-year-old MMO to take on a decently modern gaming PC, I made my way back onto the ship, and soon thereafter ended up on an island which I can only assume serves as a sort of tutorial to the game. This island I also had vague memories of playing as a child, and when the music hit, I definitely had a small wave of nostalgia. Nostalgia is a strange thing, because I remember this island being, well, a lot more graphically enticing as an 8-year-old than I do now. Anyway, the user interface appeared pretty clean and easy to navigate at first, though some of the options were a little strange. For instance, if I wanted to open all of my bags at the same time, I had to use the command Alt-I. Being an assassin, I had access to a stealth ability, which I could use in combat as well, which was a little strange, but combat overall seemed pretty normal for a 20-year-old MMO at first glance. I'll have a couple of things to mention about the combat moving forward, but my first impressions were, okay, this is pretty simple, tab target, easy to understand. Doing some of the quests on the island had already got me to level 3. Only 117 more to go. But the amount of abilities I was receiving for each level, which were automatically placed on my action bar, was a bit overwhelming. I had already filled an entire action bar by level 3, and I decided to figure out how I could get some more space, so after a bit of maintenance, I had a few action bars with a few keybinds that I was okay with. Keybinds, by the way, are pretty easy to change and customize in the options. However, I tried to make some of my abilities a shift number combo, and that doesn't work. After spending some time killing goblins and spiders, and even participating in a little boss fight within a cave, I was level 6, and ready to be done on this tutorial island. So, I made my way to Kinos, excited to explore this world and begin my journey leveling through Everquest 2. But first, a quick shout out to my Patreon subs. There you can find behind the scenes and bloopers of my MMO videos. I recently put up one showing some of the clips and bloopers from my New World video, and I was laughing the whole time I was making it. There's a link in the description. Thank you, and back to the video. Kinos is absolutely massive, by the way. Everquest 2 does a great job with the size and scale of its cities, and though there were only a couple of other players hanging out around the docks, the NPCs and overall vibe of the city was actually really cool. Almost immersive. The game quickly led me to an apartment where I was able to access my first player-owned house. Everquest 2 famously has one of the better player housing systems that actually I think New World took a bit of inspiration from. You can decorate your house with everything from rare collectible items to simple things like a wooden table or a book. It's at this point I feel like I should talk about the graphics because something was beginning to stand out to me. We often hear how the graphics in an MMO are not important to the gameplay and experience, which I tend to agree with. But we also hear the argument that stylized graphics like World of Warcraft will always withstand the test of time far better than more realistic appearing graphics similar to New World or Elder Scrolls. I also tend to agree with this. So why then do I find Everquest 2 graphics so oddly alluring despite the fact that they went with a more realistic approach in the year 2004, which should definitely not withstand the test of time? Now, I'm not saying these graphics are good or amazing, but actually, they're so bad that in my mind, they almost became stylized. This style of graphics and art is not seen in many modern-day games, and to me it has a bit of charm for just how old it is. I'm probably crazy, but I think the realistic graphics of Everquest probably looked their worst in the 2010 to 2015 era, but nowadays it's so old that I almost appreciate them. Like I said, I'm probably crazy. Anyway, I began questing. I started off with some quests around Kinos and quickly made my way to the Oak Mist Forest. One thing I was already beginning to notice is experience is slow. Most of my experience was coming from the actual mobs I was fighting, and probably about 20% was coming from actually completing quests. I could quickly tell that mob grinding was probably the fastest way to level, however completing the quest gave me something to do and work towards. Plus, you often got gear upgrades and cash. The armor to me so far was kind of interesting. My character didn't necessarily look cool, in every sense of that word, but the design on the armor and equipment was a little different than I had seen in a lot of MMOs with some very detailed texturing. With a couple of hours grinding my life away in Oak Mist, I got myself to level 10 and faced this gnoll on top of this hill. This guy actually already killed me twice, but at level 10, I managed to take him down, though not easily. The rotation in this game regarding combat skills was beginning to stand out as a little strange to me. Basically, I was just waiting for cooldowns to be up and popping every ability that I had. I was certain that this would change as I begun to understand my class a bit more and get more abilities later on, but even after putting a sizable chunk of playtime into the game, I still just pop basically all of my abilities whenever they're off cooldown. Now, I know some Everquest 2 professional player is going to come into this comment section and tell me how that's the completely wrong way to go about combat and how I'm such an idiot. I know, but I'm a new player and that's what I was doing. Now, because this game was released in 2004, some of the game design and philosophy around MMOs during that era was a little bit different to what we see in more modern MMOs. For example, back then you were expected to be quite a social player. It was actually expected of you to generally do questing and content within a group and not solo. So a lot of games from this time period, even classic WoW to an extent, definitely caters itself more to group play. However, after a small bit of research, I found out that Everquest 2 had quite a unique solution to this problem. Where many games might go back and nerf and change a lot of the starting zones and questing areas, Everquest 2 did no such thing. Instead, I present to you my mercenary. A companion who joins your party and you can purchase for a small fee. I paid 10 silver to have him join me, and then every half hour I have to pay him 4 more silver, which it takes directly from your inventory. That's pretty cheap when you consider that this dude is a freak of nature. Where I was struggling to take on 2 mobs at the same time, my mercenary Genis can literally tank like 7 mobs without barely losing any HP. He literally always keeps aggro, and on top of that, if I die, he can resurrect me. This is the single best player I've ever had in my party while ever playing an MMO. But genuinely, I thought this was a really cool and unique way to deal with the fact that they made this game during a time when grouping up and playing with others was a much more common occurrence. I actually think that a lot of games which require a fair amount of grouping content could probably take some inspiration from this system. Anyways, after finishing most of my questing in the Oak Mist area, I was finally directed toward Antonica. Antonica may be one of my favorite zones in an MMO. I'm not kidding. First of all, so far in Everquest 2, I had seen nothing of the sheer scale and size of Antonica. The vast swaths of empty, hilly fields that the 2004 graphics are absolutely not doing any justice. The draw distance in Everquest really allows you to feel quite immersed into a zone, and one particularly cool thing I noticed is that if you take a look at the city of Kinos from a distance, even though it's in a separate zone, which requires a loading screen to get to, it still feels like part of the world. I can't really pinpoint exactly what made me fall in love with the zone of Antonica, from its massive gnoll camps to fields with vicious scarecrows. I particularly liked the wooded areas that had a sort of fall season feel to them. I genuinely would love to see a recreation of this zone done in a more modern MMO with modern graphics. However, this was when I first received my Daybreak Games pop-up. The all-access pop-up. This unfortunately ripped me away from some of that immersion, as I realized that every few hours or so of gameplay, if you're a free-to-play player, they give you this message and pop-up to try and convince you to purchase their subscription. Beyond that, and this is actually crazy, every single time you exit out of the game, and I mean every single time, it opens up the Daybreak webpage with 4 different tiers of membership. The monetization in this game is absolutely disgusting, and it's kind of sad to see how they would take an older product like Everquest and leave such a sour imprint within the game. Super annoying, and I can't help but feel like there are better ways to convince people to purchase things, but monetization complaints aside, I quickly pressed X and moved on. Now, I spent a long time in Antonica. I mean it, a very long time. The leveling in this game is absurdly slow. I probably completed over 25 quests, which got me from level 10 to 14 or 15, which means I still had basically 5 more levels before I was able to move on to the next zone. I want to say in total I spent around 10 hours questing in Antonica. Now, of course, this wasn't all done at complete efficiency. I spent a lot of time actually reading the quests because some of them were actually quite interesting. I also immersed myself in the collection system. Essentially, there are things laying around the ground of Everquest, and you can pick them up, discovering a massive amount of different collections that you can complete for certain rewards. Obviously, some of them are easier to complete than others. Antonica also really began to show me how funny some of the sound design could be in this game. I mean, just listen to the noise my character makes when I repeatedly jump. Or listen to this group of skeletons maniacally cackle as they 10v1 me and Genis, my mercenary. Antonica also had access to griffins, similar to the flight travel system in World of Warcraft, except that you can't travel between zones, you could just travel long distances within zones. Which makes sense because, like I said, some of the zones are positively massive, and it would take a decent chunk of time to walk the entire thing. However, Antonica was where I also noticed that my game was beginning to have moments where it would freeze up and stop responding. At first, these were sporadic, but as time continued on while playing Everquest 2, I would have this happen sometimes upwards of twice an hour. After much troubleshooting and playing with some of the graphical settings, I was able to alleviate the problem slightly, but never truly fixed it entirely. The problem here is that Everquest was designed in a different era of tech, and it's poorly optimized to run on normal PCs. The highest graphical settings in this game will give even the highest tier GPU a run for its money. I can't really get into all the technical details of why this happens because I don't know all the technical details of why this happens. However, it can be a nuisance trying to play this game in 2023. Anyway, after about 15 to 20 hours of gameplay, I had finally reached level 18. Yes, level 18. Also, I got myself a cool cape, which definitely made me feel a lot stronger. But seriously, the leveling was so slow. I began to question myself, am I doing something wrong? So I decided to do a bit of research. I generally don't look things up for these videos while in the middle of playing, just to keep the experience genuine, but I wanted to make sure that I wasn't making some grave mistake. You see, back in the early days of MMOs, the design philosophy was quite different. The fun of the game was found much more in the journey and a lot less within the destination. It was not uncommon for games of this time to require hundreds and hundreds of hours of gameplay to get to the max level. Everquest 1, this game's predecessor, was a particularly strong example of this. People on the forums mentioning they played on and off for 5 years without ever getting a character all the way to level 60. And you can see a bit of that mentality continue to shine through within Everquest 2. I don't think this is a bad thing, by the way. I generally enjoy leveling and the process of growing stronger in an MMO more than I actually end up enjoying the endgame content and systems. So if they can prolong that feeling of progression, I actually tend to enjoy that in the games that I play. However, my research did not go unfounded. There is a way to level up quicker. There's a system within the game called agnostic dungeons that you can find and enter in most major cities and hubs through this skull-looking thing. Essentially, it grants you access to many of the dungeons and group content that have been released across the duration of Everquest 2's existence, and it allows you to replay them. They are completely soloable, especially with a mercenary, because the game actually gives you quite a massive boost to your character's strength when you enter these dungeons. I mean, I was literally dealing damage in the millions, and that was taking like 10% off of the enemy's total HP, which is kind of hilarious. But I decided to try my first agnostic dungeon, and I entered the Cavern of the Afflicted, a rather small dungeon featuring a crypt full of undead monsters and some rats. I believe there was 4 or 5 bosses within this dungeon, and while it felt extremely outdated and the mechanics were strange and interesting, I could definitely see how epic this could have felt back in the day entering with a group of 4 of your friends. This kind of content back then didn't have guides written online detailing exactly how to complete every boss and puzzle, so I can imagine a lot of time was spent with trial and error and constant wipes. But online, people were saying that I could have gained multiple levels from just completing one of these agnostic dungeons. However, I was sorely disappointed as the experience that I gained from the mobs in the dungeon was no higher than what I was receiving questing in the main world. I thought, well, maybe they nerfed it. But oh, I was so mistaken. You see, there are certain dungeons, for no apparent reason that was obvious to me, that give an absolutely ridiculous amount of experience. That was when I found out about the Maldura agnostic dungeons. There are 2 of them. One is a little bit easier to grind for experience. For some context, I was gaining about 600 experience per quest completion outside of this dungeon. But inside this dungeon, I was receiving 600 experience per mob. My very first Maldura dungeon took me from level 19 to level 24 in the matter of about 20 minutes. 5 entire levels that would have previously taken me potentially 10 hours. Seriously, on top of that, I received a ton of gear that was catered to my level, and honestly, my character was starting to look pretty awesome. But now I was faced with a bit of a conundrum. Do I continue power leveling through agnostic dungeons and potentially miss out on a lot of the world and story and zones and questing that I was currently enjoying? This was an issue that at first seemed like quite a minuscule problem to me, but as time went on, began to wear heavily on my mind. I consulted with some ducks, followed by their captain, named Sergeant Quackers, and they told me, "You must enjoy and experience the world for what it is, despite the allure of leveling faster." You see, my brain is progress-driven with modern video games. The fun and enjoyment and satisfaction that I get out of a game is intrinsically tied to the progress and experience of completing content. If there is a way to complete content faster than 99% of the time, that's what I'm going to be doing. I have a feeling that I'm not the only person who feels this way, and that actually leads me to a slight criticism here. I wish the 2 Maldura dungeons that you can complete within the agnostic dungeon system did not reward as much experience as they do. I wish they were more in line with all the other agnostic dungeons so that it would remain a viable option to go and level through just dungeon grinding if that's your thing. However, if leveling in the main world through exploration and questing was on equal terms of XP with agnostic dungeon leveling, that would allow players to have more options instead of feeling like in terms of progress, they have no choice. I decided personally to put the agnostic dungeons down for now and go experience more of the world as I was getting pretty close to progressing to the next zone. I planned on returning to agnostic dungeons, but I felt that I had more to experience first, which led me to the next zone, the Thundering Steppes. But I quickly realized that questing in this zone was a little bit more problematic than what I was used to in Antonica. Many of the mobs were not only a higher level, but they were also considered heroic. Also, just take a look at these giants. No, seriously, take a look at these fucking giants. What the fuck? I've never seen anything like this, but I love these dudes. But many of the quests in Thundering Steppes were not completable for me and my mercenary. I don't know if my class was too squishy or maybe I needed to upgrade my mercenary to somebody else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the content I was trying to participate in was simply meant for a larger group. I ended up farming some of the undead in the area for a few levels and also ended up in a quest line that took me deep into Kinos. Literally 3 separate zones underneath the city of Kinos where fighting these sewer-dwelling mobs managed to get me to level 30. At this point, I had about 35 hours played, and the fact that I got from level 19 to 24 in the matter of 20 minutes was just a thought that I couldn't shake. It was time to head back to the agnostic dungeons and see just how fast I could level up. I needed the dopamine of progression. I needed the feeling of flying through content. I feel as though I have become what I sought to destroy. Within 1 hour, I was level 40. No, I'm not kidding. I was making so much money through agnostic dungeons that I was able to purchase my first mount. This beautiful horse. Which, by the way, one of the coolest features about the mounts in Everquest 2 is that you unmount when you enter combat, and then you remount when you exit combat, without doing or pressing anything. You can also loot while mounted. It was such a strange quality of life feature that I've never seen in other MMOs, and I absolutely think modern MMOs should think about adding this. I was not expecting to enjoy the mounts in Everquest 2 quite so much. Afterwards, I also visited the zone of Free Rot, which is designed for level 35 to 45. It's a giant swamp filled with lizardmen and insects and creatures. I actually did a few of the quests around here and found the questing to be quite enjoyable. It kind of reminded me of Stranglethorn Vale from the early days of World of Warcraft. But back to agnostics, and within another 2 hours, I had acquired level 50. The amount of skills that I had been receiving from leveling up was so absurd. The ability bloat in this game is definitely at an all-time high. So many of my abilities had no use except for extremely niche scenarios, and many of them felt completely replaceable by other abilities that I already had. Some of them did literally negligent amounts of damage compared to some of the abilities that I used regularly. Also, at one point, I noticed a max level character standing near me. I'm talking decked out, as far as I could tell. And the stats on this person's gear were out of this world. I mean, my best in slot item that I currently had equipped featured one stat, stamina, of which it gave me plus 20. When inspecting this person, however, she had an item here that gave her 5,600 stamina, 236,000 hit points, and 190,000 power. I guess that kind of explains the massive numbers I was doing when boosted for agnostic dungeons. I don't necessarily know if the game needs a stat squish, but I found it kind of entertaining seeing gear with numbers that high, as generally, games don't usually push attributes and stats into the thousands. All of that to say, around level 53, and after experiencing a few more zones like Lava Storm, bad idea, and Everfrost, which was surprisingly fun, I went back to agnostics and decided to get to level 60. That was the max level when I first played the game as a child, and I really felt like that would be an excellent stopping point for me. The pride I could now have in saying that I have a level 60 character in Everquest 2, a journey I started when I was 8 years old playing on my dad's desktop computer, was completed. I felt at this point I had experienced enough of Everquest 2 to formulate some of my first impressions of this game in 2023. First of all, am I going to continue playing Everquest 2? Actually, I think so. I would like to one day have a character that can get involved with some of the community. However, I think I would like to try one of its time-locked progression servers in the future. Those are servers that allow you to experience the content in the order it came out, along with quite a few other players, as the game generally receives a lot more activity when one of those comes out. But let's get into some of my favorite things about Everquest 2. First, the absolutely massive feeling of the world presented through zone design, city design, visuals, and draw distance that, despite its aging graphics, really allows you to become immersed in this 2-decade-old MMO. 2. Having your mount automatically summon while out of combat and being able to loot from your mount. It's amazing. It's such a good experience. 3. The old-school MMORPG feel that still holds up to a certain extent in the modern day without feeling so tedious that you would rather shoot yourself in the foot. There's a very thin line between appreciating old school but becoming too annoying, and Everquest 2 does a fairly decent job of walking that line. And finally, the mercenary system that allows you to complete what was once group content without devaluing the content, but just giving you a reliable companion to take on your adventures. However, there are some things that I do dislike about EverQuest 2. First of all, obviously, the constant pop-ups and intrusive reminders that you need to spend money for the Daybreak subscription fee and the overall monetization strategy of this game, it's actually hilariously bad. 2, the few agnostic dungeons that give such a ridiculous amount of experience takes away from the good feeling of leveling out in the world and makes you feel bad, in a sense, by not taking advantage of the potential easy and almost free leveling. 3, the lack of people in the world definitely gives a bit of a ghost town vibe to what must have been once a bustling and busy place, which unfortunately gives the game a bit of a forlorn feeling that can be difficult to shake while playing. And finally, the poor optimization can give your computer a bit of a difficult time while running this game, causing freezes or crashes. This could have been on my end, but as far as I could tell, the game ran much less optimally than some of the more modern MMOs that I play, which generally are much more graphically intensive. All of that to say, EverQuest 2 is a game where you get out what you put in. If you want to level slowly and experience each zone and all the stories in the massive world, go right ahead. If you want to fly through a ton of levels or even potentially spend money to boost a character to the max level, also go right ahead. Older MMOs like this are much more concerned with your experience of the entire game as a whole and not just its endgame or particular systems. All in all, would I recommend EverQuest in 2023? Well, it's tough to say. If you're a fan of modern MMOs and the gameplay loop that you're used to, which is a fast track to endgame and taking down the hardest content in the game, whether that be solo or in a group, maybe not. But if you're a fan of the journey rather than the destination, then EverQuest 2 might be just what you're looking for, especially if you can see past the outdated graphics and certain janky mechanics. This was a nostalgic experience for me, and I plan on trying the time-lock progression servers whenever they come out. That's why I wear a hat. Anyway, thank you for making it to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. If you really enjoyed the video, there is a link to my Patreon down in the description. Yeah. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later.